Alright, welcome everyone to this next example. In this final example, we will look at a workload isolation policy. Okay, so if you're looking at the policies board in the policies example here, we have a policy named isolate workload. Okay, so let me click on the policy. The policy is named isolate workload, and it applies to a namespace called policy example app2. Okay, and within the namespace, I don't have any further selectors, which means I've scoped all the endpoints, all the workloads inside this namespace as part of this policy. Okay, and if you click on the endpoints, you can see all the endpoints are scoped as part of this policy. It appears that I have a customer workload, a database workload, a load generator, a couple of summary workloads, and a rogue pod as well. Okay. All right, so let's go back to this policy. Now, if you look at this policy, I have a few ingress rules, but before I look at the ingress rules, let me look at the egress rule. And if you look at the first egress rule, it's very similar, or rather, it's similar to the rule we had in the namespace isolation policy. This egress rule basically allows all traffic to all endpoints inside the same namespace. Okay, so I have an egress rule that permits all traffic. It applies to all endpoints, and it permits all traffic to all other endpoints within the same namespace. Okay. And I also have another egress rule permitting traffic to kubeDNS. And if you look at this egress rule, it's a bit more specific than what we had in the namespace isolation policy. In this case, I've defined the exact workload to which I'm permitting port 53, or rather DNS traffic, right? And I've specified the kubeDNS workloads in the kube system namespace to which I'm permitting port 53 traffic. So it's a bit more specific, a bit more granular than the egress rule we saw in the namespace isolation policy. Right? Just a couple of different examples, okay? Just to demonstrate the kind of flexibility of kind of policies and rules within those policies. Okay. All right. So next, let's look at the egress policy rules. Now, if you look at the egress rule, the first egress rule permits traffic from the load generator app to the customer app on port 80. The second one permits traffic from customer to summary on port 80 again. And the third one permits traffic from summary to database on port 2379. Okay. So although I have permitted all traffic to other workloads in the same namespace, on the ingress direction for those workloads, I've been a bit more restrictive in that for a given workload, I've specified which other workload can send traffic to it and on which port. Okay, so I'm being a bit more specific in this example. Okay. So let's look at the service graph. So go back to the policy introduction view, and let's dive into the policy example app2 namespace. Okay. So if you look at this particular namespace, I have the workloads. We saw customer summary, database. We saw the load generator. And I also have another pod named the rogue pod. Now, as indicated by the purple icons, the rogue pod is in the same namespace. However, it's not able to send traffic to customer. In fact, this flow is highlighted in red. And if you click on this flow and look at the policy, we see that this flow was denied in the ingress direction. Okay. Now, as you click on the flow and as you look at the flow, you see certain flows with action allow and certain flows with action deny. Okay. However, you should also be looking at the reporter of a flow. Okay. Now, For those flows with action allow, we see that the reporter was the source, as indicated by SRC. And for those flows with action deny, we see that the reporter was the destination. Recall that when you look at a policy implementation, that there are policies that apply to the source, and then there are policy rules rather that apply to the destination. And if you recall the workload isolation policy, we had permitted all traffic in the egress direction to all other workloads within the same namespace. What that means is the rogue workload can send traffic, and that flow is going to get permitted on the egress direction. However, if you recall the policy in the ingress direction, we had explicitly specified which workloads can send traffic to customer. And in the policy rule, we had only permitted the load generator. And as a result of that, as the rogue workload send traffic, that gets denied in the ingress direction. Okay, despite it being in the same namespace. Okay. So the idea behind a workload isolation policy, and this is just one example, there are many ways in which you can craft such a policy. If need be, you could have been a bit more specific in the egress direction. If you look at our policy, we've permitted everything in the egress direction, but we could have been specific in the egress direction. All right. However, in our example, we're being more specific in the ingress direction. So the point to take home is that there are many ways in which you can craft this policy, and the idea behind a workload isolation policy is you're being a bit more specific in terms of which other workloads, even if they're in the same namespace, you're being specific in terms of which other workloads can send traffic or receive traffic from other workloads, either in the cluster or within even the same namespace. Okay. So that's the logic behind a workload isolation policy. All right. So let's look at a YAML example for this as well. So if I go to my workload isolation policy, in this policy, in the egress direction, we've permitted all traffic. And I've also permitted traffic to kubedns on UDP port 53. However, in the ingress direction, we're being a bit more specific, right? We're saying that the customer workload can only receive traffic from the load generator workload. Summary can only receive traffic from customer on the respective ports, and database can only receive traffic from summary on this particular port. So for example, let's maybe take a scenario where if customer were to send traffic to database, that would get denied in the ingress direction because that's not permitted by the policy. All right. Okay, so that's an example of a workload isolation policy. Again, this is just an example. It's an example pattern. There are many ways in which you could isolate workloads using Calico policies. You can refer to our either training videos, our workshops, or instructor-led training courses to learn more about how you could apply such a policy and scale such policies, in your environment. However, this is an example, and this would work well as well if you consider it to be suitable, for your environments. Okay. All right. So we've looked at the 3 policy examples. In the next video, we'll do a bit of a recap and conclude this series on Calico policy introduction. Thanks for watching.